Good afternoon. Welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Sotloff, the director, and I'm really delighted to be able to open this event. I just want to say a couple of words. We publish a lot here at the Institute. I just checked, and we just distributed yesterday our 3,259 number 3,259 Policy Watch. We're about to publish our 70-something policy note and all sorts of policy-related material. But every now and then, our scholars produce something that, in fact, will stand the test of time. Not just something that comes in your email and gets deleted with the press of a button, but something that you will want to own for a long time, something that you will continue to come back to, something that will trigger new questions in your mind, not just today and tomorrow, but 6 months, a year, 10 years from now. And it reflects truly deep research, research that is the product of years of effort and work and travel and writing and rewriting, and reflects the expertise for which I think I'm especially proud many of our scholars and our colleagues here can rightfully claim. And so today we're celebrating the publication of just such a work. Your sons are at your service by our Richard Burrow Fellow, Dr. Aaron Y. Zelin. This is the product of Aaron's doctoral research. It is a truly path-breaking work, and I just want to commend, obviously I want to commend Aaron, but I want to commend it to all of you. You should want to have this, and you should want to read this. It will expand your knowledge of a very important and often overlooked issue. And Aaron, I want to congratulate you. I want to thank you, Rukmini, for being here with us today to delve deeply into these topics. And I guess when we're done today, I guess this is for sale, or is that it? Allegedly outside and to the right. So congratulations, Aaron, and I'm happy to turn the floor over to Matt Levitt.
Thank you, Rob. It's a real pleasure to be able to be here today to launch Aaron's book. I remember still when a mutual friend several years ago told me about a young scholar at Brandeis that I really had to meet with, who was mining all kinds of jihadi primary source material in Arabic online. I'm just old enough to have been that person at the time who rolled my eyes. What could there possibly be in the online world that we didn't already know about? And the answer was almost everything. And I take great pride in the fact that the Washington Institute, all those years ago, hired Aaron Zelin to be a senior fellow in our counterterrorism program. As the director of this program, Aaron, I have to say, has become not only the author of a great many of those policy briefs that Rob just numbered off, but also a very, very good friend. We focus on policy-oriented analysis here, but every once in a while we're given the opportunity to do something like this, which requires a tremendous amount of research on the ground, multiple trips to Tunisia and to many other places in Europe and elsewhere, combing through tremendous amounts of primary source documents. And at the end of the day, what you have here is a product that is going to open your eyes, even if you are someone who studies these phenomena for a living, as I do. Now, personally, my interest is that you all read this book. But I'll say for Aaron what he probably isn't yet ready to say, which is that as the author, he probably doesn't care if you read the book, so long as you buy it. So I've bought mine. He's signed it. Copies are for sale right out here. He'll sign as many as you buy. Wonderful Hanukkah and Christmas and Kwanzaa present. And I encourage you to buy multiple copies, please. Aaron is the Richard Burrow Fellow here at the Washington Institute, the founder of the widely cited Jihadology website and its podcast, Jihad Pod. Rukmini Callimachi, as you all know, is a 4-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and New York Times investigative journalist who uncovered significant al-Qaeda documents in on-the-ground reporting in Timbuktu and then again in many other places around the world. And so we couldn't think of anyone better suited to be a commentator on something as kind of in the weeds and substantive as this book, as you, Rukmini. And so we're very grateful to you for coming in to New York for this. So with no further ado, after setting an example and turning my phone to silent and asking you all to do the same, I will turn the floor over to Aaron and Rukmini.
All right. Been waiting for this day for a really long time. It's real. I just want to start off by saying that this book would not have been able to be done in many ways without the help from many Tunisians on the ground in Tunisia. So I wanted to dedicate it to them in their quest for a more prosperous life, or as they might say, shughul, hurriya, karama, wataniya, work, freedom, and national dignity. I couldn't have done it without them, and they're the kindest people, honestly. I also want to thank Rob, who you already heard from, as well as Patrick Clausen, our Director of Research, and Matt Levitt, who just spoke as well. Thanks for giving me a chance at such a young age. I know I was pretty raw at the time, maybe, but hopefully I've seasoned a little bit now. I also wanted to thank my parents, who are actually in the audience now. Thank you for everything. I would not be here in this position without you guys over the last few years or so, maybe a little more. I'm not going to lie, there's a lot of details in this book. And unfortunately, we don't have the time or day to get into every single aspect of it. So in contrast to what Matt said, I actually do want people to read it because I do think that the payoff is worth it once you get into it, because there is a lot of stuff in it. All right, so when you think of Tunisian jihadis or events related to them, what do you think about? Maybe close your eyes and think about it. Oh, so I need to turn this on. There we go. Do you think of these guys? These are Tunisians that were part of ISIS. Somebody who might have been paying attention a little longer, they might have been thinking about other events like the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Tunis in September 2012, or the Bardo National Museum attack in March 2015, or the Sousse Beach attack, which a lot of people know about, in June 2015. For me, I actually think about this. This is the forum post that was announced in May 2011 on the Ansar al-Mujahideen Arabic Forum, which said that there was this new group being formed in Tunisia called Ansar al-Sharia, and that they're having this founding event a few days later. And for me, it was kind of like, what's going on here? This is a few months after the Tunisian Revolution. Everybody's always talking about how Tunisia is this really secular or cosmopolitan country compared to a lot of other Arab states. And even their, Islamist movement there, Ennahda, they're quite moderate compared to, say, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. So in many ways, I wanted to understand why did jihadism become this force in Tunisia and amongst Tunisians following the January 2011 revolution. And over time, then they became even more relevant because they became one of the largest groups of people that joined ISIS. So other people are like, why are so many Tunisians in ISIS? So it expanded the study over time from my PhD to the actual final book. The final book has all the ISIS stuff in it. To do this, there was a lot of work, though, to cover all of the prior history because nobody really looked at Tunisians involved in the movement previously because they weren't really in leadership positions or key ideologues in the movement, but really more these middlemen, and I'll get into that more specifically. So to do this, to do this, I went through a lot of Arabic magazines as well as biographies from the jihadi movement from the 1980s and 1990s to be able to really piece together who are these individuals and what were they doing over time and how do they connect to each other. In addition to this, I also had the opportunity to get a hold of a bunch of court records in Europe which tied a lot of Tunisians to a number of different plots, as well as attacks that were happening in the 1990s and 2000s as well. So I was able to triangulate a bunch of these sources as well to really piece together a lot of the story prior to the 2011 revolution. In addition to this, I also had the opportunity to go to Tunisia a number of times and actually meet members of Ansar al-Sharia, as well as a returned foreign fighter that had been in Syria. And I was able to go to some of their demonstrations and events. I went to their mosques, and I also was able to get some of their dawah literature that you might not be able to get online. So I did be able to get some stuff that like people weren't able to in terms of the online resources, like things like this. So it provided an extra layer of understanding that maybe you wouldn't have gotten just from the online primary sources. In addition to that, I think it's important to be on the ground because you could really get a feeling of what was going on there and how these guys were trying to show themselves off and what they're actually doing. So for those that don't know Arabic, this says Obama, Obama, kulna Osama. Obama, Obama, we are all Osama bin Laden. You could see that these people really believed in this and that they weren't worried about being in the shadows anymore, but they can publicly say this now. So having that feeling there, because I actually, I was there a number of times, but 2 times in particular were really interesting. I was there right after the assassination of one of the politicians, Shukri Belaid, as well as I was there right after the designation of the group half a year later. So it was some interesting times seeing the differences in what was going on. In addition to that, as Matt alluded to, there are a ton of primary sources online from this group and what they are doing. And in some ways, this picture is very meta because it's one of the releases Ansar al-Sharia put out, but it also shows in the picture that there's a guy with a camera and he's about to take a picture of the individuals involved in sort of this caravan that's going from a city all the way to a more rural area to provide some level of charity or medicine or clothing or something along those lines. And I've got a lot of data. So there's 18,000 files from Ansar al-Sharia in particular that I have. So I was able to really dig deep and explore. And as Rukmini was telling me last night, she's like, this is dizzying the amount of detail. And that's why I really want people to read it, because there is a lot of information, but it's really interesting. So from the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan to a terrorist attack in Mali during the actual protest movement before Ben Ali was overthrown, unbeknownst to many people, Tunisians were involved in these movements and have been involved going back 30 years. And so this is actually the first martyrdom notice of a Tunisian who died in Afghanistan in the 1980s when they were fighting the Soviet Union, from one of the magazines I was talking about. And while they seem like a very organized and well-structured movement and groupings currently, or at least in the past decade almost now, in the 80s, this was not the case. As Abu Musab al-Suri said in one of his major works, quote, "Unfortunately, and despite having many faithful and good members among them, the reputation of the Tunisian brothers among the Mujahideen groups in general became that of a scattered group with a less than perfect image," end quote. That being said, they were able to get better over time within their own context, and they're not mere footnotes within the history of the jihadi movement, even if they weren't well known. They played important roles as foreign fighters in Afghanistan, in Bosnia, the Algerian Civil War, as well as in Iraq after the U.S. invaded. They're also key cogs in logistics, facilitation, and recruitment networks based in Europe, operating mainly out of Milan and Italy, but also had networks in Paris, Brussels, and London as well. In addition to that, Tunisians had various leading and support roles in large-scale attacks, including the 1998 embassy bombings in Africa, as well as the Ahmed Shah Massoud assassination, 9/11, the Jerba synagogue bombing in Tunisia, the Casablanca bombings, as well as the Madrid train bombings, as well as thwarted plots and attacks too. So in this picture here on the top is actually the first statement claiming responsibility for an attack inside of Tunisia in 1995. By the GIA alongside Tunisians against a border post in Tunisia. And then the bottom one is sort of this fax that was sent to Al-Quds al-Arabi as well as Al-Hayat, claiming responsibility for the Jerba bombing. So the number of Tunisian foreign fighters, especially those who fought in Iraq after the U.S. invaded or were involved in logistics, facilitation, and recruitment for it, help in many ways also explain why so many Tunisian foreign fighters have joined the jihad in Syria over the last 9 years or so. The key recruitment guy for ISIS actually, before 2011, was a Tunisian. and he lived all the way until 2015 when he died in a drone strike. In many ways, if you look at the history of this movement, there's a through line between what happened in the past and what has evolved, and that affected the growth of both Ansar al-Sharia and then later with the Islamic State. So many central figures that became leaders in AST, as well as later with ISIS, gained a bevy of experience in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, such as people like Saif Allah bin Hassin, better known as Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, who is the founder of Ansar al-Sharia, Sami Yasid bin Khamis, Mahdi Kamoun, Muaz al-Fizani, Hassan al-Brik, Bubakar al-Hakim, Tariq al-Harzi, Sabri Yasid, Muhammad Bakhti, and Wanes al-Fiqi. I know, it's a lot of names, but they're important. The thing to also note about the pre-2011 era is that between 2003 and 2010, there was this growth in a prisoner population as a result of deportations, extraditions from Europe, as well as people that were arrested in Syria that were attempting to go to Iraq, as well as local arrests related to people getting involved with AQIM in Algeria prior to the revolution in Tunisia. And because of this sort of put together then this first generation of Tunisian jihadists that were involved in Afghanistan and Europe in the 1990s, to then more of the second generation that got mobilized in relation to the Iraq War, as well as the networks in Algeria related to AQIM. And in that time period, they're able to come up with new experiences and lessons learned together, and essentially preparing for what would happen when they were released from prison. Therefore, there was this opportunity for a golden age of jihadism within Tunisia, but it was not necessarily guaranteed to succeed or proliferate as much as it did. And part of this is because they actually started to come up with a plan in 2006, 5 years before the revolution. And I was able to uncover this information based off of an interview by one of the 20 founding members of the group that had been imprisoned at the time. And part of this is on the 50th anniversary of Tunisia's independence, former President Ben Ali gave amnesty to some leaders in Ennahda as a goodwill gesture to them. But the jihadis in the prisons were like, well, if they get out of prison, maybe we will too one day. So as a result of this, you saw that they were starting to plan what they would actually do once that happened. And, you know, if you look at other jihadi groups, we've seen this in other places like Yemen with AQIP, or more recently and probably more well-known related to the Camp Buka camp in Iraq in relation to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But if you look at the perspective from the movement, Abu Ayyad stated about his prison experience, I consider the period of imprisonment as one of the best periods of my life in the matter of knowledge-seeking and jihad, end quote. Moreover, unlike in Egypt, Libya, or Morocco, there were no ideological revisions happening within the Tunisian jihadi movement in the prison system, and therefore Abu Ayyad claimed that this provides merit for the jihadi current in Tunisia itself and allowed them to stay true to their own ideology. So with that said, though, they were in prison, and then this is what happened. This is the general amnesty that let prisoners out of prison in Tunisia after 2011. This is what I call in my book the original sin of the revolution. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't let political prisoners out. That's totally legitimate because Ben Ali was an authoritarian leader. However, I do think that there should be a smarter process in understanding how to deal with actual terrorists, and that it could potentially provide a lesson in the future related to potentially what's going on in Sudan now, or maybe even Algeria, and how to better handle it to maybe retry them in a more legitimate or democratic system. So the transitional government's lack of oversight of this prisoner population, combined with sort of pressure from below because of the revolutionaries for legitimate reasons, released many hardened jihadis with past experience back out onto the street. Among this grouping, you had about 1,200 individuals, with 300 who had previously fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and Somalia. Moreover, the transitional government maintained little legitimacy and focused mainly on preparing the country for their constituent assembly elections, which would happen in October 2011. This provided sort of this initial space for AST to formally organize itself and spread its ideas to gain new followers. Following the elections, though, the al-Nahda-led government became more engaged than the transitional government on how to deal with AST, but its gamble on what I call a light touch policy failed in many respects. And this is encapsulated in a quote that Hamidi al-Jabali, the prime minister at the time and a senior leader in Ennahda, said about guys in AST in terms of the importance of sort of dialogue. He said, quote, "They are sons of Tunisia, they are not from Mars." So AST successfully exploited Ennahda's soft power approach to further recruit, embed itself within Tunisia, and challenge secular left intellectuals and artists, as well as even the Islamic legitimacy of Ennahda themselves. Part of the reason Ennahda did this, though, was based off of their own experiences in the late 1980s and early 1990s when they were cracked down upon by the Ben Ali regime, and therefore they figured that, look, we got cracked down upon hard, we were put in prison, many of them were exiled to Europe as well, and now we're in power 15 years later. We shouldn't do the same thing here with these al-Qaeda guys. Because who knows, maybe in 2025 or 2030, al-Qaeda will be in control of Tunisia. So that was the reasoning behind what they did, though it obviously did not work out in the end. So AST decided on a dawah-first approach instead of a jihad-first approach based on lessons learned from what happened in Iraq, as well as the particular conditions within Tunisia. Abu Ayyad noted in an interview, quote, "All our actions are now summarized in moral preaching and works of charity. I am convinced that Tunisia is not a land of jihad, but is a land of religious preaching." Abu Ayyad also realized that people needed to be educated in the true understandings of Islam, or the ones according to AST, of course, before Tunisia could be ripe for jihad, because you had about 50 years or so of this secularization project, first with the founding president Habib Bourguiba, and then later with Ben Ali, and therefore they wouldn't understand necessarily why jihad was necessary, and therefore they had to educate them. So this dawah-first approach allowed AST to reach a broader audience than if it had sort of been this classical clandestine type organization like al-Qaeda. Funny enough, I wrote some articles at the time in the aftermath of doing some initial research on their primary sources, as well as some trips on the ground in Tunisia. And apparently they actually liked the article themselves, and they reposted an Arabic version of my article on their official Facebook page. And it wasn't demeaning at all. It just said, here's a report from an American. So I figured I was maybe on the right track. In terms of what they actually did, in the 2.5-year period that they were around, they conducted around 900 discrete activities within Tunisia. They're characterized by a number of opportunities for individuals to become involved, whether through outreach, religious education, or through charitable and relief efforts. And just to show you some examples based off of their own primary sources. So here is one of the examples of one of their caravans where they would go from a major city to a more rural area, and they would provide clothing, they would provide medicine, they would provide food for people, and then they would help them out. And that's one of the ways they're able to attract new followers. This is an example of one of their yearly conferences. This was in Kairouan, in sort of the center of the country. And this was highly controversial at the time because it woke many people up, especially on the secular left, to what was happening in the country and what essentially Ennahda was allowing to be about. Then you have here a case of one of their religious forums that they would have lectures about a variety of issues. Some of them were outside like this, others were in actual mosques. And in relation to the mosques, they also use it besides for prayers, of course, but use it as a way to mobilize their resources and have individuals get ready for the different type of activities and charity events and dawah that they're attempting to do. In addition to that, they also just had regular types of demonstrations, and it included women as well. And I think that's one of the important things to note is that while people talk a lot about how there's this growth in women getting involved in the Islamic State more recently, there are actually women involved with Ansar al-Sharia as well. So in many ways, a lot of the themes you see with what happened in Tunisia with Ansar al-Sharia, in many ways then happened with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Of course, they were far more violent. So the charity and service activities in many ways were in the service of spreading the group's ideology. It also helped that AST's message resonated with many individuals that were looking for something new post-revolution, but especially those who had become disillusioned by the slow process of democracy and the transition, since there weren't really a lot of tangible results right away and a lot of politicians were bickering. But instead, with AST, because they're showing off all this stuff on their Facebook campaign, that they're doing something through social media, whether it was propaganda or not. And one of the key sort of messaging frames that they used to try and convince people to get involved and really buttressed their ability to get new recruits was this idea of brotherhood. I remember this AST member once explained how his friend joined the group, and he said, quote, "One day he came to see me to understand what was the special feeling we shared. We are more than just friends, we are brothers. We share ethics, and between us there's a special strength and solidarity." And when I met AST members, they actually did dawah on me, so I totally understand it. And as somebody that's an outsider, they made me feel comfortable and welcomed, and I know that sounds crazy, but it is true, but that's how they do this. So I can understand how somebody from the local milieu there could be interested in this as well. It's also one of the reasons why I titled the book, "Your Sons Are at Your Service," which was one of their slogans and had the power for those involved to show that they were not only doing something on their behalf, but also for the community too. In addition to that, unsurprisingly, part of the messaging was related to defending God and Islam, but more important and more related to what happened later on with the Iraq and Syria story is this idea of building an Islamic State. So their second annual forum, they had one of the slogans being a building block in the project to establish the caliphate state. This is in 2012. This is before anybody was paying attention to ISIS, anybody was paying attention to Iraq, anybody was paying attention to Syria. And then in the aftermath of their third annual forum in 2013, in their posts, which is the one on the bottom, they started talking about how the Islamic State we are building, saying that this is a process we were actually doing in Tunisia at the time. So this, in many ways, what happened in Tunisia from 2011 to 13 helps explain what subsequently happened with Tunisians that then joined ISIS. In many ways, those that joined were primed by their experiences with AST. Furthermore, the final idea that they put out there, especially when they started getting under attack by the Tunisian government, when Nahda started waking up to the reality of what could potentially happen if they allowed them to continue to just operate openly, was Duat Allah Baqiya, the call of God remains. And for those who study and know ISIS, Baqiya is one of their biggest slogans. And again, this is in 2012 and 13. So you see these different parallels and similarities in many ways. But overall, when you look at this broader messaging system, it provided an individual with a purpose that both benefited himself and encouraged solidarity among group members by helping them believe that they are fulfilling God's promise and bettering their communities. This incentivized individuals to remain active and encouraged new members to join the group, even when the group came under threat from the state. And there are a number of interrelated processes contributing to the eventual fall of AST as an organizational presence and sort of the return of foreign fighting as the key method of jihadi activism. Part of this is what Abu Ayyad called his inability to manage the so-called stages between dawah and jihad, which allowed for a growth in violence within Tunisia, even if the original intent was this dawah-first approach. As he noted, quote, "In this period we're in the dawah phase without abandoning jihad as an obligation," end quote. In reality, for anybody that follows jihadism, it's an inherently violent ideology, and therefore this nonviolent approach was never sustainable, even if he wanted to have this happen. And then we saw certain incidents like the Nesma TV riots, which were ahead of the October 2011 Constituent Assembly elections, where Nesma TV in Tunisia played the movie Persepolis, and it showed an image of God, which for jihadis is considered blasphemous, and therefore they did a riot in front of the home of Nabil Karawi, who is the CEO of this TV station. And then you also had the Anubha College Niqab protests, where they wanted to get women to wear niqab, but they eventually ended up taking hostage the dean of the school. And I actually had the opportunity to meet the dean in Tunisia, and he talked about that experience itself. And then, of course, finally, the image on the right, and you might recognize it since it's part of the, cover of my book, from a different angle though, is the Sharia protest that the group did in March 2012, essentially trying to get it as part of the Constitution of Tunisia. This was a major turning point, though, as well as the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Tunis in September 2012. And these are actual pictures from within the movement of the attack from the inside. And as you can see in one of them, they actually raised their black flag on the property of the U.S. Embassy there. And then, of course, you had the assassination of the two leftist politicians, Shukri Belaid and Mohamed Brahmi. In addition to this type of activism, AST allowed its members to be involved in these Hizbah-related intimidation tactics and assaults, essentially vigilantism, where people who drink alcohol or were breaking the Ramadan fast or maybe trying to pray in front of a Sufi shrine, they would attack them, hurt them. Some people even were killed. They actually tried to light some of the Sufi shrines on fire. And then because of this, they then started to create these neighborhood committees. Part of it was an impetus in the context of the one-year anniversary of the Constituent Assembly elections, because that was the one-year mandate where they're supposed to finish writing the Constitution. They, of course, didn't, but they continued doing it and just continued the mandate. But AST wanted to make sure in case things fell apart for some reason. But then they officially activated them more so in February 2013 in the aftermath of the assassination of Shukri Belaid. And as you could see from the bottom, you had this like marauding group of individuals patrolling the streets in various towns and cities in Tunisia at times, which led to violence, of course, too. As a result, while Ennahda initially situated itself as sort of this moderating force between what it saw as secular extremism on the left and Salafi extremism on the right, mounting AST violence in the country paired with critiques from the left about Ennahda's complicity in this forced the party to take the issue more seriously. And you saw them using the actual legal mechanisms to try and make sure that they weren't able to do their dawah forums and conferences. And in the aftermath of not allowing them to hold their official conference in May 2013, Abu Ayyad put out this video message sort of mocking Ennahda for what they allowed them to do. And he said, quote, "Our religion taught us to thank those who is worthy of being thanked. And you, Ennahda, today are the most worthy of people to be thanked, since you committed stupidities that were a reason for the spread of our dawah," end quote. But a few days later, Rashid Ghannouchi, the head of Ennahda, turned back and he was like, quote, "Wherever those jihadis, the Kharijites of this age are, there is destruction and ruin. I challenge them to give me one state where those reckless people have succeeded. Are Somalia, Iraq, or Afghanistan stable countries," end quote. So this speech in many ways illustrates the shift that Ennahda had in the public discourse and discussions related to AST. But by this time, many Tunisians involved in the jihadi movement were already leaving to go to Libya, Iraq, and Syria. Part of this was also due to the government's ineffectiveness to stop people from actually going, even though they sort of knew the dangers. The Interior Ministry at the time, Ali Larayed, asserted, quote, "We deplore these young people from going on misadventures. We are watching these things closely." So you could see that they had some idea, but they essentially were like, we don't have any actual legal measures to stop them, especially if they're saying they're going for abroad, for work or tourism, especially in this new democratic context. So although Abu Ayyad had this strategy of dawah at home, he also called for jihad abroad. And one of the interesting interviews he did in February 2013, where he gleefully said, quote, "Tunisians can be found everywhere in the land of jihad. The ways are going are easy, and we don't stop people from leaving," end quote. And in my own experiences, when I went to some of the AST mosques, I saw members of the group doing these special du'at or blessings after the normal prayers for the mujahideen in Bilad al-Sham. So you could see that they're very much connected and into what was going on in Syria at the time. In addition to that, you started to see them putting out propaganda like a nasheed that would be for Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, who is the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, or signs supporting Jabhat al-Nusra, as well as martyrdom notices for Tunisians who actually made it to Syria as well. But following the designation of the AST as a terrorist organization by the Tunisian government in August 2013, the movement changed very much. No longer was it this cohesive entity that was run by Tunisians and primarily focused on Tunisia, but more globalized again by big brands like the Islamic State. Once again, Tunisians returned to its historical norm of one characterized by foreign fighting as well as individuals involved in facilitating and plotting attacks. But because they had this highly connected nature to what happened in Iraq after the U.S. invasion, these were the same networks that brought people into what was going on in Syria, and therefore they're highly connected to it. It's also important to note that even though Ansar al-Sharia was this al-Qaeda group and many Tunisians ended up joining up with ISIS, we shouldn't project back the fight between Al-Qaeda and ISIS that has been going on since 2014 into that time period, because there weren't the same kind of issues between them. And also the fact that Abu Ayyad, back in the day when he was in Afghanistan, actually met and knew Zarqawi. So during this fighting period between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, the Ansar al-Sharia actually took a relatively neutral position. And at the time, other leaders in Ansar al-Sharia, after the group was designated, sort of filled this gap, such as Abu Ja'far al-Hattab, Kamal Zarut, Bilal Shawashi, and Bubakar al-Hakim, telling people that they should join ISIS. Plus, IS's dawah activities and messaging resonated for many people based on their past experiences with Ansar al-Sharia. And if you look at sort of the dawah program of ISIS, many Tunisians were involved in helping develop it based off of their past experience. So Abu Waqas al-Tunisi became the face of IS's dawah program in 2013 and appearing in half a dozen of its videos online. And therefore, this idea would resonate with many AST recruits who felt that their mission in Tunisia had only just begun. And I remember talking to one of the Tunisians before all this in 2013, and he said, quote, "The dawah is going on, but then after that, it is global work, not just here in Tunisia." It is no surprise then that IS's Voice of Asham magazine in September 2013 featured a picture of Abu Waqas alongside a part of a Quranic verse, "The believers are but brothers," next to him. Of course, they're using it for their own cynical reasons. However, they did use a lot of different pieces of the Quran as slogans, both ISIS and Ansar al-Sharia. And as you could see from the picture above, it also says the same thing. So they're using the same kind of narrative devices to attract followers in many respects. While this soft approach appealed to some, a more extreme approach attracted others, especially after Ennahda's crackdown, which radicalized a number of Tunisians. Tunisians became involved with this ultra-extremist trend within ISIS called the Hazamis, which is named after Ahmed Umar al-Hazmi, who is a Saudi religious scholar, who sort of perpetrated this idea called chain takfir. Essentially, if you don't put takfir or excommunication on another Muslim, then you yourself are not a true Muslim, and therefore I can kill you. So it's this chain of events where you just, a lot of blood. So that's why it's called chain takfir. So as a result, even though there's conspiracy theories within al-Qaeda groups that the Tunisian government was bringing in all these individuals to try and sully al-Qaeda. In fact, Ansar al-Sharia actually had al-Hazmi in Tunisia in 4 different lecture series, and he even opened up a religious institute there between December 2011 and May 2012 in coordination with AST's cleric named Abu Muhannad al-Tunisi. Hazmi's works were also part of AST's curriculum, which is part of the screenshot on the left. This exposure to ultra-extremism, especially for guys like Abu Ja'far al-Hattab, as well as other Tunisians, led them to even question Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi eventually when they made it to ISIS and they were eventually executed. But this also doesn't necessarily surprise you then why a number of Tunisians were involved in a lot of violent actions within Syria itself. For example, one case, Hamza Maghraoui, who was involved in the capture, torture, as well as the idea for burning alive the Jordanian pilot Muaz al-Qasasba. So they're involved in many things. In addition to this, the founder of the female-led Al-Khansa Brigade, which was essentially a women's Hizbah patrol, was founded by the Tunisian Rayyan al-Tunisi, and she not only helped build it up within Syria, but then went to Libya when ISIS started building themselves up in Libya to help create it there as well. So I'm going to skip a little bit of history now and move to sort of where we are maybe closer to today. So in terms of IS in Libya, if you look at sort of the transition to the Tunisian state being on more of this defensive front in relation to this building growth of the jihadi movement, the changing of this scenario happened when ISIS and Tunisians in ISIS in Libya tried to take over the town of Ben Gardan, which is close to the border with Libya. The purpose of this attack on that day in March 2016 was to take over territory that spanned both the Tunisian and Libyan borders, so it'd be like Iraq and Syria. It also had a lot of importance in the lore of ISIS because Abu Musab al-Zarqawi once remarked regarding Tunisians who came to Iraq after 2003 that, quote, "A city called Ben Gardan is found in southern Tunisia, but it had been located on the borders of Iraq, then Iraq would have been liberated years earlier," end quote. So you see this importance here, but even though there was this base and that there were individuals who had been involved in the jihadi movement from this town, they were not successful, even if when they came into the town, they said, "Don't worry, we are the Islamic State. We are here to protect you from this non-believer government." But in fact, a lot of the civilians teamed up with the National Guard as well as the military to push them back. And as one local resident named Umar said, quote, "This is our country, and if we don't protect it, nobody else will." And this was very resonant within Tunisia at the time. And this started sort of slowly turning back the ISIS within Tunisia and their broader movement to try and do things there. Even though they had successes in the year prior in relation to the Bardo Museum attack as well as the attack in Sousse, as I mentioned. Since then, Tunisia has been able to slowly degrade this movement, and I actually have good news to end this talk that jihadism is currently at its lowest point in many ways in Tunisia since the revolution. However, challenges do remain, whether with the prison population, because there are many reports that they're doing the same things that they were doing in 2006 to 2011 time period again, as well as the necessary reforms that are needed within the judicial and prison sectors, as well as Tunisians currently fighting abroad still, and those that are in jails and camps in northeast Syria. In many ways, Tunisia is in the same position it had been prior to 2011 in terms of the status of the movement, yet the state has gained a ton of experience and has better understanding of the reality of this movement now. So even if there is a larger group of Tunisians involved now, they have better tools to deal with it than they did before. Plus, unlike other Arab states, which are undemocratic, Tunisia has the possibility to harness its robust civil society to help with these issues on the front and both back ends of radicalization process. It's my hope then that this research will allow others in the field to better understand the reasons why Tunisians got involved in this movement, both with Ansar al-Sharia and the Islamic State, and the other underlying processes that led to it. I hope that other researchers can then build off of this and make it even better. Thank you very much. Also, oh yeah, that's where we're sitting. I gotta get my water. And a piece of paper.
So first of all, thank you for your talk, and especially for this book, which I think is going to be a resource to anyone that's looking at both the jihad of Tunisia and more broadly at the radicalization of people in this group. I wanted to ask you a few questions, if I could. It's not on?
Just make sure at the base that it's on.
It's on? Okay. It is definitely on.
All right, there we go.
Okay.
Sounds
Is that
better now.
I wanted to ask you a few questions based on the research you've done. And I wanted to reflect on a couple of the themes that I think are of great interest in your book. One of the things that jumped out at me is that if you look at the initial evolution of Ansar al-Sharia, at least in its first couple of years, you see an organization that in fact is not violent at all, and that is primarily interested in providing services, and providing them quite well, according to your own telling. Caravans bringing clothes, medical clinics offering medical help in areas that perhaps didn't have it, charity drives, etc. That is often surprising for Westerners to hear when they're thinking about a terrorist organization. And it points to something that you reported, I think, quite thoroughly, and that is the ability of terrorist organizations to learn from the lessons of the past. We think of them, especially in the media sphere, I think, as static, as static in their violence, as all bad. And especially in the news world, there's a bit of a pushback when you try to write stories, as I have, about the services that ISIS provided in a place like Mosul, with the thought being that you're somehow doing their PR for them. By saying anything good about them or anything good about what they've done, you're helping their image in the world. I was particularly struck by a quote that you had from Atiya Libi, a well-known al-Qaeda leader, who talks about the failure of the jihad in Algeria and the excesses of this group that we know as the GIA. The GIA at one point in their jihad had really made important gains in Algeria, and then they went too far. They became very brutal, they became very extreme, and the atrocities that they carried out, including against other jihadists, ended up turning Algerians against them. And I just wanted to read this because I thought it's so telling of an organization that is learning from its mistakes. This is Atia. Ask me whatever you like about Algeria between 94 and 95, when our movement was at its height of its power and capabilities and was on the verge of taking over the Algerian government. The government was on the verge of a downfall. I lived through that myself. I saw firsthand what happened. No one told me about it. However, they, meaning the jihadists, destroyed themselves with their own hands, with their lack of reason, with their delusions, with their ignoring of people, with their alienation of them, with their lack of kindness, with their lack of sympathy, with their lack of friendliness. And he goes on to say, there must be attention paid to raising the Mujahideen through continuous modification and not being quiet about our mistakes. So you describe Abu Iyad, the leader of Ansar al-Sharia, as somebody who grew up, through this movement. He was well aware of the failures of the GIA. Later on, he became aware of the failures of what happened in Iraq. At the same period of time that you were starting your research on Ansar al-Sharia, I was based in West Africa. And in 2012, AQIM, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, took over most of the northern half of Mali. I reported that story like pretty much everybody else. You couldn't go there. And so what we did is we reported on the atrocities of this group. That was the thing that made headlines. It was surprising for me in January of 2013 when the French went in and were able to flush out the group. And I went in behind them and found thousands of pages of documents that the group had left behind, that you actually see the group having discussions internally and being chastised internally for examples of extremism and of brutality. And the example that stood out for me is in Mali. One of the things that the fighters had done is they had gone out and destroyed the mausoleums of Timbuktu. The mausoleums were a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They destroyed them based on the belief that these are tombs, that they encourage people to venerate saints. Therefore, it's a violation of Tawheed, the notion that you're showing your devotion only to God. So they went out and smashed them. The way that we reported that story and the way that most people talk about it is that this was a monolithic action within AQIM that was somehow approved by the group. And in fact, it wasn't. One of the letters that I found was from the leader of AQIM, where he upbraids the fighters. And he says to them, theologically, you might have been justified in destroying these tombs, but strategically, you were not. What you did is something that turned the people against you. And we are now in a period in our jihad that he described to the planting of a small tree. Our jihad is like a seedling, and we need to help it grow. And how do we help it grow? We help it grow through services, through being good to the people, etc. I wondered, in light of that, if you could speak about the policy implications of your work, because it's easy to see how to react to a group like Ansar al-Sharia when you link them to the Bardo attack, when you link them to the Sousse beach attack, when you see that members of their group have gone and joined ISIS. But in the period where what they appear to be doing is mounting caravans, bringing medical aid to rural areas, what do you do about that?
Yeah, it's a very complicated question. I think we're seeing what's happening now actually in Idlib, Syria, as a consequence of this purely securitized approach, because you've had the Al-Qaeda-like group there, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, essentially controlling the province, but because of that, nobody wants to do anything about the civilians there, which is quite unfortunate because there's 3 million people there, and not everybody in that location are obviously jihadists. They're just trying to survive. But I think, as you alluded to, a lot of people still look and frame this issue as like, this is still 2001, this is still like right after 9/11. The jihadi movement is not really a vanguard anymore. It's not necessarily, let alone an insurgency here or there. But it's really a social movement in many ways, and it has its own subculture. And dealing with this purely military and law enforcement approach, while is definitely useful and necessary, is not going to
deal with all of the issues related to it and why people are getting involved in terms of the broader structural problems in the Arab world, as well as many problems in Europe, as well as the social dynamics there that sort of undergird the appeal of these different groups over time. I think if you look at the case of Ansar al-Sharia as well as ISIS, a lot of these people got involved not necessarily for the violent reasons. Of course, some did who are truly sadistic, but many of them were interested in these societal projects and helping people out. And therefore, I think it's important that these local governments and even governments in the West provide alternative avenues so that people can do this in a way that's not this violent theocratic ideology, with opportunity and entrepreneurship and really opening things up. And so I think that this then would resonate more with people. And it's one of the reasons why a number of Tunisians after a year or two started joining the group, is because they're disappointed by what happened after the revolution. They expected that there'd be this change overnight. As we know, democracy is kind of sloppy, and it's not easy, but people are expecting like economic gains, and even 9 years later, there's still problems economically. So I think that there needs to be a greater focus on providing this for the younger individuals as well as society at large, and bringing them into the fold and not this sort of purely centralized system. I think Tunisia is doing a good job in that they've sort of decentralized the government. They've been doing municipal elections. So hopefully over time, this will provide more stakes for the local population. But it is a process.
Thank you. One of the other very interesting takeaways for me from your book is the fact that this is a group that calls itself Ansar al-Sharia, not Al-Qaeda in Tunisia. There's been an ongoing debate that continues to this day about whether this group was in fact an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. I think you lay out very convincingly, with all of the evidence that you put together, that at a very minimum, this is a group that was a shadow affiliate of Al-Qaeda. You point to the fact that Abu Iyad was writing letters and receiving responses from Zawahiri. As somebody who's tried to write to Zawahiri, it's not that easy to get a hold of him. He was also addressing letters to the heads of the other Al-Qaeda affiliates. He was in contact with Nasr al-Wahishi of AQAP. He was in contact with the head of Boko Haram, the head of Shabab. And as you point out in one of your last chapters, Abu Iyad actually dies in Mali alongside AQIM. Around the time that Ansar al-Sharia comes forth, we later see through the Abu Rabat documents that there was a move inside Al-Qaeda to no longer name its franchises Al-Qaeda, for the very reason that they understand, the work that Matt Levitt used to do at the Treasury Department, and how designations occur, and how being able to tie something to Al-Qaeda results in punitive measures from the West, from targeting to sanctions. So there was an active move on the part of Al-Qaeda to essentially hide its associations. You see that in Yemen, where a similarly named group was essentially a front for Al-Qaeda. In Mali, you have the group Ansar Din, and today, even today, I can have fights with people about the fact that they still believe that Ansar Din is not really Al-Qaeda, despite the fact that we found documents indicating that. Can you speak to the policy implications of essentially this fig leaf approach, where groups are taking on a name that no longer has the Al-Qaeda label in it? And what evidence do you seek to actually understand their true colors?
Yeah, it makes it more complicated because you really have to have more evidentiary proof then. I remember, if you look at the case of Syria again, when Jabhat al-Nusra was created and the U.S. designated them as sort of an arm of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of Iraq, a lot of people were like, these aren't Al-Qaeda, these aren't like the jihadis of your grandparents or something like that. And as a result, it had complications because a number of people on the ground actually backed the group, even if they wouldn't necessarily agree with what their ulterior motives were, which is what we've seen over the last few years or so. In addition to that, it makes it a lot harder for those doing research because a lot of it, understanding of it is behind the scenes because these are clandestine movements in many ways, and it's harder to then prove what's going on. But because they do have these primary sources, it does make it easier. However, I think especially Al-Qaeda in particular, they've probably learned and are a bit smarter about this in some ways and holding back information in comparison to maybe ISIS. But it does illustrate that there needs to be sort of this vigilance within those who are doing research on it and those within government to continuously stay on top of this issue, as well as understanding these changes within the movement. And that I understand that they need some evidence when they designate people, for example, but maybe there's a way of speeding up the process, because I know that there have been cases where groups have been designated after some attack happened and not beforehand.
Right.
And therefore, because they haven't been designated necessarily, then those who might go over and join them as a foreign fighter, there might be consequences related to that in a courtroom, especially potentially in like places where in Europe where things are a little bit different than the U.S.
Right. You laid out how the prison period that Abu Iyad went through and the other jihadists went through very much acted as an incubation method, much the same way that Camp Bucca behaved in Iraq. In light of the fact that Tunisians had one of the largest groups of foreign fighters, and in light of the fact that Tunisia, unlike many other countries, has actually taken back quite a large number of them, do you see any improvement in how they're dealing with their returnees? Do they have some special sauce now that they've figured out in terms of de-radicalizing these people?
I don't know if they have any special sauce. There are 3,000 people from Tunisia that went and joined ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and about 1,500 people that went to Libya to join Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, as well as ISIS there too. So it's a high number. We've seen, at least according to the Tunisian government, that 1,000 people have returned, and I'm sure a number amongst them have died in both battlefields. But I think the thing to remember is that, not every single person that necessarily goes when they return are interested in jihadism anymore. A number of people have become disillusioned because of this infighting between Al-Qaeda and ISIS there, or the level of brutality that they saw there. So it has to really be on a case-by-case basis and being smart about identifying who truly is still like hardcore within this movement and who is not. And there have been a number of cases where the Tunisian government has interviewed people when they've returned and made some assessment, and therefore they're back in their communities. You have seen them over the last 2 years or so starting to implement these pilot projects within the prison system with civil society associations to do some level of rehabilitation and reintegration processes. Obviously, it's easier said than done. Especially since you do have radicals that are still in prison. So there is this peer pressure type of scenario in the same way you see with like gangs in the inner cities in the U.S. But the hope is that this will hopefully help out in the long term. And one of the policies that the Tunisian government is doing too is that they're not just working at this national level, but they've had a series of workshops and meetings with a lot of local officials and associations in all governorates, not just in the coastal regions, but also in the interior, because the interior usually is seen as not being as developed or as much attention, but at least in this case, they have been. So hopefully that could then provide this sort of communal backbone so that people that are being returned into the community will have a basis where they can actually get their lives back together after they do their prison sentence, and not necessarily relapse in the future. Of course, like I said, it's a lot easier said than done.
Right. Thank you so much, Aaron. I thought I would open up the floor to questions from our educated audience. Does anybody want to start us off? Yes, sir.
Yes, hi.
Wait for them.
Roy Gutman. I'm with the Institute here as an associate fellow. I was wondering about that number of Tunisians going to Syria and Iraq. It really is huge. I think it's disproportionately huge considering all the other countries that also supplied volunteers there. Apart from the grunts, apart from the fighters, the volunteers, the cannon fodder, there were, I think, a lot of Tunisians who became emirs, who became leaders. Yeah. And I was wondering whether you had sorted out, are there any patterns by which you could find in their CV? Had they, for example, fought in the Iraq insurgency, or how did they become emirs in such significant numbers?
Yeah, I mean, as I alluded to, a number of Tunisians had previously fought in Iraq from the 2003 to sort of 2009 time period, and many of them didn't actually go back home to Tunisia, so they remained there throughout that period. So there's this sort of continuity in some ways between individuals, and for those that paid attention to what happened in Iraq, a lot of the leaders in Iraq in the late 2000s were killed as part of the US's campaign with the surge, as well as the Sahwa movement, the tribal awakening. And therefore, over time, a lot of the Tunisians were elevated because some of them came in the early years in 2003. There's actually some Tunisians that were from France that went to Kurdistan in Iraq in the fall of 2002 before the US even invaded. So you could see that they're highly connected to this movement and what they're attempting to do. So some of it was related to that. Others, those that had experiences, whether they went to Libya before they went to Syria, so they had some fighting experiences there or involved in sort of the operations that was going on over there. And then, of course, just the fact that they're involved in a lot of bureaucratic and administrative type of roles within Ansar al-Sharia themselves. So they were seen as useful because they had these skill sets necessary when they're organizing and doing these types of events and activities.
About the role of Ansar in Europe and the degree to which the terrorists in Europe from Tunisia are French Tunisians born in France or born in Belgium, or are they Tunisians per se, and the symbiosis and the degree to which de-radicalizations in Europe may or may not be working as well?
I mean, if you look at what was going on in the 1990s, that's where a lot of the Tunisian movement was happening, was in Europe, in these networks that I alluded to in Milan and Paris and Brussels and London. Many of them, if you understand the jihadi movement, they don't necessarily even consider themselves French or Tunisian. They consider themselves just as Muslims. So I think that's something to think about in the first place. But again, it's complicated. You really have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. This is a very complicated issue, and you can't just securitize a whole community. Not everybody that's from Tunisia or Algeria or Morocco or wherever is a jihadist, of course. And each individual had their own experiences growing up. They had their own experiences getting involved in these movements. So, I think that it's important that officials really take a nuanced approach related to this. Otherwise, you're just going to provide no choice in many respects for these individuals to only be involved in these movements in the same way you see with this issue of a number of European countries stripping the citizenship of these people. So then they have no home. So what are they going to do? They're just going to stay in the movement then. That doesn't really solve things in the long term. So I think we need to be a lot smarter about this.
I can point out that having covered the Charlie Hebdo attack in France, the Paris attacks in November of 2015, the Toulouse train shooting, the Brussels attack, there seems to actually be a preponderance of what I would say are Moroccan French and Tunisian French. My colleague Scott Shane did an article about what he called the 1.5 generation. These are people who are born in those countries but come as a child to Europe, and are in a way caught between two worlds. They can't get the stain of being an immigrant completely off of them, even though they learn French fluently in Belgium or in France. And strangely, you don't see, for instance, I can't think of that many Algerian French that have been involved in recent terror attacks, or Libyan French, or it seems to be those two countries in particular.
Yeah, Dario.
Hi. Dario Cristiani, German Marshall Fund. First of all, congratulations on publishing the book. We spoke about this in June. I have actually two questions. On top of the many interesting things you said, there is one that I think it's extremely important, this idea of the country of preaching rather than the country of jihad. And if we see the recent results with the elections, both the presidential elections and the parliamentary elections, we can see that certain groups, I'm thinking here to the party called Karama, they have emerged, and many Tunisians were surprised about that, if you speak to local politicians in Tunisia, you might realize how there is this sort of like social conservatism which is emerging. So I'm wondering whether this kind of activities, they did not have like the impact that some of these people were expecting in terms of promoting jihad immediately, but whether this can be something that in the long term can create a culture that can eventually bring more people closer to this sort of cultural word. And the second point is it's more about a problem that I think there is in the community of researchers on Tunisia, and more broadly speaking on the Maghreb, which is, as a European working on that, I can see a lot of Europeans who come during the summer. They stay in Sidi Bou Said, in La Mars, etc., and they think, oh, this is an amazing secular country. Then you move beyond the GP9, and you realize that the situation is way more different. I'm not saying here go living in Ben Arous or Et Tadamen, but if you already come to Lawina or like in downtown Tunis, you can see this element. So, do you think that there is a problem also in the way we see as Western analysts Tunisia, which is well beyond, it's very different from the rest of the Arab world, of course, but that we somehow overestimate this peculiarity and in which there are this element of social conservatism that every now and then we overlook because we spend a lot of time in Sidi Bou Said, Gamart, etc., and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Those are great questions, and it's great to see you again. In terms of sort of the residual effects of what Ansar al-Sharia did, it's actually interesting just because there's this research that I've been doing behind the scenes with Nate Rosenblatt, who's doing his PhD now, about the potential for these residual networks in a longer project and what this could mean in the future. And he has more of this quantitative background, so he's able to use a lot of the primary sources I was able to do from more of a qualitative perspective and make sense of it in terms of how you see these networks evolving over time from Ansar al-Sharia to ISIS to more recent arrests just in general, and that there are essentially these hot zones within different communities where this might be going on. And one of the interesting things is that this could become a larger issue in the long term just because of this. And one of the things I didn't mention is that is that there were children involved in Ansar al-Sharia too, just like ISIS. So they were trying to socialize these people too. And it's hard to know what the experiences of a child when they're younger have and how that might affect them when they're older, and how that might manifest depending on what could happen in the future. But again, it's complicated, and you don't want to over securitize or make everybody feel like they're part of this, because then it just pushes them towards it. In terms of research, I agree. A lot of research likes to stay in the nice parts of Tunis. Luckily, I had the opportunity to go outside of Tunis and to some of the small villages as well. And as you say, it's a very different scene. And I stuck out like a sore thumb with my red beard. But it's important to be there and see it and feel it to have a better understanding of it. So I agree. I can understand why people do that, though, because it's more comfortable and they might be worried about their own security potentially, but it does help out in the longer term. And I actually remember when I first started here at the Washington Institute, one of the founder of the CT program actually here, Mike Stein, talked to me privately, and he said, don't focus on the politics of the capital, focus on what's going on in the rest of the country. And this is in 2012 when I first started here. So that was also something that I had in mind too, and I was able to really look at. And I think it's something important to understand and realize that, yes, it's easier to understand what's going on in the capitals of a lot of these Arab countries, but it's not necessarily the whole country. In the same way you wouldn't look at what's going on here in DC and extrapolate that out to the rest of the country, since I don't need to go any further in explaining that.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask about financing. I mean, one of the things that really struck me in the Dawa work is how quickly they were able to get out there. And I think they were giving medicine and setting up clinics in about the same time it takes to fill out a grant application for if you're a secular NGO. But it's a little unclear to me how they were able to do that so quickly. Beyond just the planning to do that, you've got to have money and resources and trucks and everything like that. If you could talk to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's a complicated question since obviously they're not going to talk about that in their propaganda or even really want to broach it when you talk to them in person. If you look at some of the stuff they're putting out, though, it's clear that they're using sort of these auxiliary religious associations to do a lot of this work that was part of the broader network, as well as the fact that they were teaming up with some of the charities in the Arab Gulf states as well with some of this. And a lot of their dawah literature was actually bought from bookshops within Saudi Arabia. So while I can't prove 100% that there was like these transactions and connections between these, traditional Al-Qaeda financiers within these Gulf states, based off of what we know about how these networks operate, it was likely going on, and that there's just some tea leaves here and there. And the thing, too, if you look in the Abbottabad documents, Al-Qaeda was talking about sending operatives from the AfPak region at this time to Libya and Tunisia, too. So I'm sure some of those individuals linked into what they had already been doing outside. So.
It's an honor to see you publish your book. I look forward to reading it. Jesse Morton, Parallel Networks. A lot of things came to mind when you were speaking. I think it's a fascinating piece of scholarship, and I really do want to dig into it. As someone who watched you from the other side and now watches you from this side, it's quite interesting and intriguing to see. One thing I have to say is that there's always this delay in awareness, right? So when you pay attention to ideology and propaganda, you can see how they're conscious of the fact that the rural areas are most susceptible to the message and the ideology. And so what we know now, 2018, we publish based upon data collected by ISIS applicants that the socioeconomic causal factors were more important than the ideological factors between North African jihadists that traveled to ISIS and those that were from the Gulf region. And now we have sort of a transition with regard to a lacking willingness to repatriate foreign fighters and a serious concern, an increasing concern for those that are imprisoned. And you talked a lot about the situation of prison and what a role it has played for the jihadist community over time. Mm-hmm. Essentially what the jihadists are doing right now is they're looking at geopolitical alterations, and they're waiting things out either in the mountains in Tunisia in the west or whatnot, or in other countries like Iraq and Syria, and sort of hiding, laying low because they see a recession on the horizon. They see the rising authoritarianism, and they see a concern for Iran increasing, and so they plan on being patient like they always are. But at the same time, for us, we're now shifting with regard to the realm of preventing and countering violent extremism with the passage of the Global Fragility Act, which will put $1.5 billion in the hands of peace-building organizations that know nothing about ideology and the role that it plays in being able to understand fluctuations and transmutations in the communities that they try to alter. What is the Tunisian government up to, not just with regard to reentry, rehabilitation, and reintegration of those that are incarcerated, but with regard to the realm of prevention? Do you know how the government is dealing with this? Because certainly the conditions are ripe for a resurrection at any time a void is exploited.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. The Tunisian government actually had a grant for about $10 million, if I remember off the top of my head. Don't quote me on it. I think it's actually in the book. So it's at the end of it, because at the end I talk about different programs and things the Tunisian government's been trying to do over the last 2 to 3 years to a bunch of different associations to deal with sort of this prevention. They haven't gotten really into the details of what that specifically means, but essentially trying to target youth and children in the educational sphere as well as building up a research methodology and understanding within the Tunisian university system so that it becomes sort of part of a societal understanding. And what's interesting too is, as you know, there's always this issue of like whether this works or not in the whole monitoring and evaluation. But they actually wrote in the press release related to this that there was going to be a monitoring and evaluation for these 5 associations that got this in total $10 million. Obviously, it's not a ton of money, but it's better than nothing. And we'll see where it goes, because it really, they only announced it within the last year or so. So, as you know, these things take time. But it is something that Tunisia is working on. So I will commend them for that in many respects, and that they've gone beyond just this purely military and law enforcement approach, but it's easier said than done.
Thank you, and congratulations again. You mentioned a number of the parallels between Ansar, Al-Sharia, and ISIS, and I was wondering if you could talk explicitly, one, to the role that female fighters played in Ansar al-Sharia, and then secondarily to propaganda and whether Ansar's propaganda served as a template for ISIS, kind of what apps were they using at the time, and did they have that same kind of slick media apparatus? Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, so in terms of the first question, women were definitely involved in Ansar al-Sharia, though it wasn't a large part of their propaganda. Sometimes they put out information related to it, but if you talk to people on the ground, it was definitely a part of it. They took more of the approach of letting them do these things privately with other women in houses and meetings because they wanted to, separate the sexes. So it's a little harder to get at all of the dynamics, but there are some cases where they would, in their media, post women going to hospitals and providing presents and gifts to people that were sick, or when they're demonstrating in front of the Ministry of Interior within Tunisia in relation to the different abuses that they saw the Interior Ministry doing. And a number of these women then went on and went to Syria or Libya, for that matter, and joined up. So they had these same experiences as the men, and that's part of the reason why many Tunisian women took on these leadership roles within ISIS in the sector of what women were able to do within ISIS, of course. In terms of media, AST was very unique because it was they were sort of like this hybrid between sort of the old school forums online where the Al-Qaeda network was, and also before sort of this big growth on things on Twitter a few years later. They actually used Facebook primarily for a lot of what was going on. And even though, they had accounts up, I will give credit to Facebook. Their accounts went down about 94 times in the 2.5-year period. So even before Facebook was truly paying attention to a lot of this stuff, they still would take content down back then. Another potential research project in the future to explain this. But what was interesting is that similar to what you saw with ISIS and how they had all the wilayat and the branding related to different media offices, Ansar al-Sharia would have different logos and different branding for each city or town or village that they were in to sort of show off this to the locals so they can take ownership over it in many respects. So this branding and identity was very important in many ways also. Obviously, the quality of the content wasn't maybe as good as what we saw with ISIS because this was also earlier in the decade. And also, I'm unsure they put as much money into it in the same way ISIS did. So it really depended on which release. Some were really nice and high quality. Others were not as much. But the thing is that this movement in general, they learn from all of their experiences over time and integrate it into what they're doing. So there are definitely Tunisians that were involved in the media sector within ISIS too. So I'm sure that they took lessons learned from their experiences with AST and then used them within ISIS too. So there was a lot of transfer of knowledge between what was going on in Tunisia with what happened with Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, but also with ISIS in Syria and ISIS in Libya too.
What I thought was so interesting was that picture that you showed of the caravan with the media operative walking alongside to take pictures. So it's obviously not just the charity and the act of doing good for fellow Muslims, it's the act of doing charity and mediatizing it, and
there's a
telling people about it.
performative aspect to it.
Right. In towns around Mosul, the people who were the head of public works for ISIS told me that they would typically get a call once a week from ISIS's media arm, and they would want to come and basically just film the potholes they had just filled in or the very clean streets that they had that they had just cleaned up. So again, very much, it's to be mediatized. It's not just doing good.
Is there any other question? Yeah.
Brian Stout. Just a quick question. Does Tunisia continue to detain common criminals together with jihadis?
Yes. Yeah, it's not the best situation, though. They are trying to build new prison facilities to try and have separate corridors for just jihadists themselves. But we'll see how much that happens, just because it takes money and there still is an economic issue within Tunisia itself. Anybody else have any questions, comments? Matt?
So, if memory serves, this whole project started nine plus years ago when you were online and saw, I was about to say a tweet, but I'm sure it was something much deeper web than that, about the creation of something called, Ansar in Tunisia. So, when you look over the course of this kind of 9-year period, can you just offer some commentary on kind of the trajectory of the whole phenomenon of jihadism in Tunisia, and maybe some thoughts about kind of where it's going from here? Like, what are the constants that you've seen, despite all the change that you discussed in your opening remarks, as we think about contending with a phenomenon not limited to Tunisia, but that based on the foreign fighter flows and the wounds that are Syria, et cetera, are going to be with us for, at least a generation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can go even past 2011 all the way to the beginning of the movement in the 80s and 90s in many respects, is that even though there might be failures by the jihadi movement, or they're pushed back tactically, or their losses, that these individuals, when the next thing comes around, then just switches their brand name, switches the group name, uses the networks for the new activity. So they went from Afghanistan to then working on things in Bosnia, to then helping out with Algeria, to then helping out with things in Iraq, to then back after the revolution helping out with the local movement, which then turned into things in Libya and Syria. And now, I mean, even, just as a crazy example, there was a Tunisian who was arrested in the Philippines a year or so ago who was trying to join up with ISIS there. So it shows that they're able to be very nimble in what they're doing. They're not strict in this process, and therefore, whatever happens next, I expect that these same networks will be used, whether for ISIS or Al-Qaeda or even some other new group that sprouts up, and that's why I think the most important thing about this book, in many ways, and why I think it's important to read it because of all the details, is that you can really understand the evolution in these networks and how there's this through line in many ways going all the way back, and how it's there's this level of continuity in some respects. Obviously, some of the figures change over time. But without knowing this history, you're just going to continue to get the same sort of upswing where some group pops up, everybody's like, oh my God, how did this happen? Where did this come from? Then the US and other allies will come in and smash them down, and you'll just start the whole process over again, as we've seen from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to Libya to Mali and the Sahel now. So I think it's important for us to know the history.
Can you join me in giving a hand to Aaron Zelin for 9 years of work? Thank you.